Now, in our game, I'm using all naive approach, mostly, because the calculations are more involved, and I didn't want to go into explaining them. And in a very lightweight game like this, you're not going to see any problem. Also, I'm mostly relying on physics for movement, and physics is happening in the background. Physics movement is handled by Corona, so frame to frame to frame, as long as I'm not getting a frame lag, it will be smooth. But anything involving you calculate, like if I were calculating the camera movement or something, that could look a little sketchy if I started to get a lot of frame lag or stretch or time, like say one frame took 60 milliseconds and the next one took 15 because it tried to catch up, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, drawing a new segment. In essence, what do we need to do here? We want to draw a new segment of our hallway, but we don't want to do it until we need it. So how do we determine when we need it? What we do is, first we need to remember is I have a table. We can actually, I'm going to say that you can ignore this first line here, 177. What I'm doing basically is when the game loop starts up, I don't want it to start trying to draw segments until I've created a table where I store them and the player object is present, because there's no point in trying to draw more segments if there's no player yet. So in the beginning of the game, I initialize the wall module, and this code should never execute, but I like to be safe. So just in case, I put a check in here that says don't do anything if you can't find the player, because the subsequent calculation here requires that you have the player. So if you've got no player, this will crash. So line 1 of this function, I call the player module and I say give me the player, which may either return a reference to the player or it will return nil if there is no player yet. Assuming that we get past this part where I have a place to store my wall segments and my player exists, the only other thing I need to do is say, since the last time I drew a wall segment, and I'm keeping track of the last Y position of my wall segment, the point where if we look at the game, for this wall segment right here, last Y is right here. Then if I were to restart the game, this wall segment right here, this path segment, last Y is right here, and then this path segment, last Y is somewhere up here. What we're keeping track of is where the last vertical ending point was, and our calculation is, assuming our calculation is we just calculate the distance between where the player is now and where that ended, and as soon as we get close enough, we draw another segment. So that's, I take the player position, I subtract the last Y position, and this gives us a delta Y, and then I compare that to my minimum draw distance, which is just some value, which in this case I've made it very short so we can see the wall segments coming in. So if I run this now, and if I actually tap the screen, we'll see that I go down the hallway and the wall segments suddenly appear, which we don't want. But I've made the minimum distance very short, so it doesn't draw the hallway until I'm almost at the turn.
Gotcha.
So what I can do here, if you're playing with a code, is I can go in here and locate min offset, which is the top. And I made it 50 pixels. But in reality, when I'm playing the game, I want to make it about twice the height of the screen, so it's way off the screen. So by the time I get there, the wall segment will have been drawn. I'll never see any popping. Now if I restart the game, and if I steer, gotta remember steer. Okay, can't play my own game. As I steer along, I will never run out of hallway because off screen it's being generated. It's drawing all these segments, and way above the top of the screen is the last Y position. And as soon as I get within 2 full screen heights of that position, I draw another segment. Let's go ahead and find that again. So as soon as dy is less than that minimum distance, I call the draw segment code, which we talked about last week and the week before, which automatically knows where the last ending Y was. It selects a random hallway length, knows the direction to draw it in, left or right, and it draws that segment. And that's basically all there is to it. So every frame, all we do is we run this little piece of code and say, have we gotten high enough yet to draw another segment? All we have, draw another segment. No, we haven't, don't do anything. As you might suppose, let's go into game for a minute. So in game.lua on line 125, I'm going to uncomment this bit of code that says remove segments if needed. This is the opposite. Now we're saying, again, give me the player. Don't do anything until we've got the wall segments container and we've got the player. Game hasn't really started until those things occur. But assuming that, calculate the distance between the player and a minimum offset which is below the player by 2 distances. And then we go through and we look at every piece of the hallway, the wall segments, the path, the glow, all that stuff that we put into this table previously. If we look up here, this is the bottom part of the wall creation code. And we created the left wall, and we stored it in wall segments using the index of the wall itself. We created the right wall up above, stored it in wall segments. The background, that little square for the corners, path back to the left glow, the right glow, and look at this, a little typo. I stored the wall twice. Okay, you didn't see that. The point being is every time we create a part of our hallway, we store it all in this table, which I created at the top of this file. So it's visible to all the functions below. And then let's go down to our code again. In our remove code, I have calculated a distance, which I just called delete Y. I could have called it anything. And then I iterate over every object stored in that table, and I check to see, is that Y greater than the delete Y distance that I just calculated? So I calculate the distance 1, which is basically a position. So if it's at that position or further, I simply wait 1 second, I remove the object, and I take it out of the table.